Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Triandafiliou, and I'm the scientific coordinator of the Brave and the Grease project. And I'm very happy to welcome you all together with my colleagues here at our virtual seminar room. For this, we believe, quite interesting and we hope also quite useful workshop. The Grease project is about the governance of religious diversity and the prevention of violent radicalization that is religiously inspired or religiously attributed. And it has developed a set of indicators that you will hear about in the effort to assess how different countries govern religious diversity and whether the ways in which they govern religious diversity can give us ideas about how to prevent or address radicalization. Now, the BRAVE project is also a Horizon project that is actually what is in technical terms called a coordination and support action. So our work in the BRAVE project has been to bring together academic knowledge with input from stakeholders and discuss in a way where do we go from there. You can find, of course, a lot more information about the two projects on their respective websites. And in the BRAVE project, we have created indicators that try to measure the level of polarization, violent extremism, and resilience, on the other hand, in European societies. And we're very happy to partner with our colleagues from EFOS, the European Forum for Urban Security, and the BRIDGE project, which is also an EU-funded project, which looks at the use of indicators about violent radicalization from local authorities. And of course, our colleagues will explain more about it. So we have three sets of presenters for the first part of the workshop. So Lili Yakova and Rosica Zekova from the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia have been our partners in Greece leading the work on the indicators. Likewise, Cheryl Prentice and Paul Taylor from Lancaster University have led the work in the BRAVE project on the indicators, and our colleagues Moritz Conradi and Esther Caraxoni from EFOS have led the work in the BRIDGE project. So each of them will make a short presentation about their indicators, and then I'm very pleased to have with us three discussants that are real experts and can give us really very interesting input from, how can I say, the world of both theory and practice. So I think Rick Kulsayed from Hand University needs no introduction in a way for those who have worked on issues of violent radicalization. And we're very pleased to have you with us. Rick, he's also a member of the advisory board of the BRAVE project. Mathieu Orsi from DG Home and the European Commission, thank you also for making the time. Will give us, we expect a little bit of your critical discussion of what can be the use of indicators like the three sets that we will be presenting here. And Maarten van den Donk, who is an expert also in, how can I say, the fight against, in terms of prevention and addressing violent radicalization. And he's a member of the Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN. And Maarten, thank you too for being here. So in a way we have academia, policy, and civil society here, and we're delighted. Some housekeeping, information or details. So we will first take the three presentations in a row. And because we are aware that still, virtual meetings can be a little tiring, we're gonna have a 5-minute break at the end of the presentations, and we expect it to be approximately 1 p.m. when this happens. We would like to encourage you, well, if you need to take a small break and fetch some water, take off your camera and microphone. But in the meantime, we would like you to use these 5 minutes to think also of your questions or of your comments on our presentation. So after 5 minutes, we will promptly resume. We encourage you not to leave the virtual room so that we don't have technical issues. And then we will resume, starting with the discussants, a short response from the presenters, and then questions from the floor. Please write your questions in the chat. You can also write them while the presenters speak. This is no problem. My job here is actually to keep an eye on the chat and try also to group questions if we have many, and ask them to our discussants. So while we encourage you to have your camera on, if you wish, please keep your microphone off during the webinar. We are not going to be asking people to speak because we feel that this will make us lose time and we won't have the opportunity to have enough questions, but you're very much encouraged to write your questions and comments in the chat. The chat is visible to all. So you can also see if somebody else has asked a question that is of interest to you. And as I said, I will, my job will be in the second part of the workshop to kind of take up the questions as they come and ask them to the presenters. So again, a very warm welcome to our virtual room of the Global Governance Program at the European University Institute. My colleague Valentina Bettin is behind the blue sky there, and she's with us in case we have any technical issues, which I hope not. And here is actually the floor to Lily and Rositza to start the presentations.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen before I begin. Okay, so Rositza, my colleague Rositza, and I from the Center for the Study of Democracy will present the Greece indicators. We call them the state religion governance indicators, and we'll also present some comparative insights from results. Anna already shared a little bit about the Greece project, so I'll not go into too much detail regarding the project itself. Maybe what I can add is that it's a global project, so we have partners from multiple continents, not just in Europe. And specifically about the indicators, what is the goal of these indicators? So when we started conceptualizing them, we did that with the idea to transform complex academic knowledge into a simplified scheme, into a toolkit, which could be used by experts, stakeholders, and policymakers, so that they could monitor developments in their countries regarding state-religion relations, the governance of religious diversity, violent radicalization, and the efforts to address it. So to give you a very quick overview of what this toolkit looks like, so it's composed of 4 composite indicators and their dimensions. You can see here on this slide that the first 2 composite indicators relate to the relationship between religious institutions and the state, rights of religious minority groups. And each of these composite indicators is composed of sub-indicators, which have legal and practical dimension each. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. You can see then for composite indicators 3 and 4, they focus more on radicalization. And specifically composite indicator 3 looks at level of violent radicalization. And composite indicator 4 looks at prevention measures. And you can see here that there are various dimensions within these composite indicators. So how did we come up with this toolkit? We consulted the academic literature on these topics. We consulted existing indices on these topics. And also, of course, we were in consultation multiple times with the partners on our project. So once we created the toolkit, we decided to apply it to 23 countries around the world. And how did we do this? So here on the slide, you can see how we did it for each of these composite indicators. So we used the expert knowledge of the partners on the Greece project, specifically for composite indicators 1, 2, and 4. The partners did expert assessments in the application of the indicators. They also did desk research. They relied on legal reports, policy documents, research reports, and media reports. And it was a little bit different with composite indicator 3. In addition to relying on desk research to apply the indicators, the partners also relied on survey data to capture perceptions, attitudes, and experiences of local populations in their respective countries, and largely also on pre-existing global indices and country scores, such as the Global Terrorism Index, the Freedom in the World Index, Fragile States Index, and multiple other indexes. So we, after the application, and we collected 23 assessments for 23 countries, we collected the data, we processed the data, and we came up with some comparative insight results. And before we present some of these results, I would like to mention a couple of limitations and caveats when we are interpreting the results. First, it's important to note that we focused in our analysis on the most recent years for which the data were available. So the data we're reporting now, they're based on results from 2015 to 2020. For us, it was not possible to highlight changing trends in some of the indicators simply because data were missing on some measures. And therefore, we need to be cautious with interpreting results. Also, the results we'll be presenting now are composite indicator scores, and these are based on the aggregation of several measures relating to different aspects of each composite indicator. So when it comes to quantification and the final score, it is important to keep in mind that these scores may not capture all nuances and contextual differences within countries. So we were quite aware of this at the point when we were creating the indicators, because countries are so different and context is very, very important. So I would like to quickly explain to you in more details what composite indicators 1 and 2 are about. As you already saw in the previous slide, composite indicator 1 is about autonomy and freedom of religious institutions and groups from the state. This is what it measures. And it is composed of 8 sub-indicators. Here on the right side of the slide, you can see examples of some of these sub-indicators. And each of these sub-indicators contains a legal and a practical measure. So the legal measure has as a goal to look at what the legislation says about the particular sub-indicator. And the practical measure has as a goal to see what is really happening in practice regarding the specific sub-indicator. So in this method of looking at the sub-indicators, we have the opportunity to see how things are according to law and how things are in practice and compare the two. And the logic of composite indicator is very similar. It's composed of 7 sub-indicators. On the right side here, you can see some examples of these sub-indicators. And again, for each sub-indicator, there was a legal and a practical measure. And regarding composite indicator 2, I'll present briefly some results. Here, the level of rights of religious minorities, we looked at the legal dimension and the practical dimension, and the scores here, what do they mean? 1, we used the Likert type scale. 1 means very low and level of rights, and 5 means very high level of rights. And what we observed here, we're just presenting an excerpt on Europe because of space and time, we cannot present more. What we noticed across the board, not just in Europe, is that in the majority of countries, there are discrepancies between the legal and the practical dimensions. And in the majority of countries, the legal scores are higher than the scores for the practical dimension, meaning that according to law, in many countries, there should be a high level of rights of religious minority groups. But in practice, that's not always the case. Of course, there are a couple of exceptions to this rule, such as Bulgaria, France, the UK. But even with these exceptions, you can see here that they're not that great. When it comes to the greatest difference between the legal and the practical dimensions, Albania, Spain, and Morocco turned out to be kind of not outliers, but to stand out. So we can discuss this additionally later on during the Q&A. Now I'll give the floor to Rossi to talk about radicalization.
Hello, everyone. Let's turn our attention now to two other SIP indicators, that composite indicators that measure, that actually deal with radicalization, violent extremism. And just without going too much into theoretical discussion, it's still important to kind of mention definitions and concepts. And these are the definitions and our understanding of the issue at hand, derived from the broader theoretical framework we use for the GREASE project, because as you've heard, the GREASE project deals with a lot of different issues, not only radicalization. So we kind of try to operationalize the theoretical framework so that we can work towards the indicators. And here it's important to mention that we kind of distilled like three main factors or dimensions that are important when we look into radicalization leading to violent extremism. And first of all, of course, the socioeconomic and structural conditions in a given country, but they're not sufficient to look at. We need to look also at social experiences and interpretation of these. So what we call often grievances, how these material conditions or structural factors are being lived by people and by societies and by groups in society, and how they're expressed in terms of grievances. And finally, the ideological frames which structure these grievances and mobilize them into violent extremist ideas and actions. So the composite indicator tree, as I mentioned, deals with violent radicalization. So based on this notion, we actually focus on three main dimensions. The first one is the structural, we call that structural factors or drivers. It basically tries to capture the broader conductive environment, if I may, and structural and contextual factors that may or may not give rise to individual and group discontent. And here we have 8 sub-indicators which look into things such as the level of freedom, civil liberties, adherence to the rule of law, protection of human rights, but also economic inequalities, group grievances, government restrictions on religion. And here we mostly rely on already available global indices, such as the Fragile States Index, different components of it, not the whole, the Freedom in the World Index, and so on. The second dimension, we call it perception-based. And here we basically aim to capture in a more direct way, as I mentioned, the social experiences and interpretation of certain material and structural conditions by societies expressed through different political, economic grievances, social polarization and discontent. And here we look like things, some examples, things like distrust in government, dissatisfaction with democracy, or dissatisfaction with their own economic situation, but also discomfort with minorities, with particular focus on religious minorities, discrimination experienced and perceived, and also perception related to violent extremism, to what extent it's perceived to be a threat in a given country. And the last component is, we call it incidence-based component. So basically here we try to capture the incidence and impact of religious violence, conflict, incidents related to kind of religious hostilities, including terrorism, but not only. And here we also rely on two already pre-existing indices, such as the Global Terrorism Index and the Social Hostilities Index, which I'll talk about a bit later. So just to give you a glimpse, unfortunately, we cannot go into much detail why the data is the way it is, and kind of compare and contrast. And this is only a small segment of the whole indicator set. But just to give you a glimpse into how the perception-based component of this indicator performs in Europe, I have extracted here only the data for Europe. It's a crowded slide, but let me walk you through it. So the first dimension, the first kind of pillar of this perception-based dimension is the political and economic grievances. And here we kind of bundled several measures into one. It wasn't possible for the entire perception-based component to come up with a single score, just because there are too many kind of conceptually different aspects. And also we felt that if we do that, a lot of contextual information will just be blended out. So in the first pillar, the data shows that we do have substantial differences in the expressed political and economic grievances in different societies. Greece leading with over 70% here. Basically, it's easier if you look at the color. So red means higher level grievances and green lower. So it's based on percentage of the population that expresses such grievances. So we have Greece with over 70%, which of course is mostly related to prolonged economic crisis, political and social distress, but this has different kind of reasons in different countries. The second pillar is discomfort with minorities, and here we're talking about mainly discomfort with religious minorities and Muslims in particular. The data here mostly comes from surveys, from the Eurobarometer survey, but not only, because we're quite good in Europe with having such data on perceptions. That was not the case for the rest of the world. We did have a lot of problems with getting our hands on such data, and also data that's comparable across different world regions. So here we see for this pillar that Central and Eastern European countries such as Lithuania and Slovakia showing the greatest level of discomfort with religious minorities, Muslims in particular, and in Western Europe these scores tend to be lower. The next pillar is discrimination. It's quite an interesting one because we looked at three different aspects. Basically perceived among the general population, to what extent people think that discrimination based on ethnic and religious grounds is widespread in their society. And here we have Bosnia leading with over 80% of the population expressing such views. And then the experienced discrimination is also divided into two. Basically experienced discrimination among the general population and among particular minorities. And we think there's some potential to unpack this further, looking at these differences because they're kind of important discrepancies. Like for instance, again, we have in Greece, Slovakia, Bosnia and France, Slovakia and Greece, the share of experienced discrimination among minorities is higher. Just to note, the minorities that we're talking about here that have been surveyed are different for each country. So, and the final pillar deals with threat perception concerning violent extremism. And this is a trend that we have seen for the past several years, that it's quite high across Europe. But it's also interesting to compare this with the actual incidence of different terrorist acts or different kind of violent extremist actions. A classic example is Italy, where the threat perception is quite high. 80% of people think it's a kind of high threat, but actually that does not correspond to actual incidents. So moving on to, it's my last slide, I promise, for this presentation. Then again, very important component of this set of indicators was the so-called incidence-based dimension. And here it's important to note that initially we had a lot of different suggestions for measures, which we, in conversation, kind of in the validation and piloting phase together with our partners and with the kind of academic board of the project, we had to discard for several reasons, because there's no data or it's not reliable and so on. So we ended up taking these two measures that already rely on global indices, such as what I mentioned, the Global Terrorism Index, which does measure the incidence and impact of terrorist acts, but it doesn't discriminate on the motivation, the ideological underpinning of these acts. So it encompasses all kinds of terrorist activity. The other one is broader, social hostilities involving religion, and we felt it's a bit more closely aligned with the definitions we adopted, because it does focus on religious violence and hostilities, but it encompasses a lot of different types of incidents, harassment, including hate crimes. It does include terrorism as well, but it's just one component of a much broader set of measures. So here, again, I have highlighted Europe. In general, in Europe, we see increasing scores for social hostilities, not necessarily related to the high incidence of terrorism. It's more like, just to name a few examples, like here we have this high scores for Germany, France, and the UK. It's related to things as increasing hate crime based on religious hatred, or violent demonstrations by far-right groups, increased rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, so different factors. So Just to conclude, I think it's important when we look at this course, it's very important that we actually have the narrative explanation behind that. And we actually have done this, and you can see this on the website, because this course can only tell you that much. It's very important that we also kind of try to explain the context and put these numbers into context. And we have actually for each country that we included in the sample for the indicators, we have a narrative assessment report which tries to do that, tries to explain why do we see these numbers, what is the context, and so on. So kind of to interpret the data. Also, we are quite aware that we haven't captured very important dimensions, which I mentioned in the beginning in the theoretical framework, like ideology or online propaganda. So we are quite happy to discuss with you later on how this can be improved, what can we do with this, and how can we go a step further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosita and Lily. It is, of course, difficult to condense in a 15-minute presentation the work actually that was started in summer 2019 and went through many iterations, because in the GREECE project, and I'd like to clarify that the GREECE project includes several academic partners from North Africa and the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, from South and Southeast Asia, and Australia. So as you can imagine, it has been a challenge to find indicators that make sense for all these countries. So this is probably something to keep for the discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to ask Cheryl to present the BRAVE indicators. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Right, hello everybody. So my name is Cheryl Prentice. I'm going to briefly discuss the creation of a set of polarisation and resilience indicators for the BRAVE project, along with their applications, limitations, and a worked example for you. So the BRAVE project is a European Commission funded project which received funding via the EC's Horizon 2020 fund. It's led by Anna, who has introduced herself to you, and by the European University Institute. It consists of a consortium of a number of institutions, including the Central European University in Budapest, Lancaster University in the UK, Dublin City University in Ireland, Cultures Interactive in Germany, the Centre for a Jewish Inclusive Europe in Brussels, and IT support from ITTI in Poland. So its aim is to bring together researchers and stakeholders to jointly inform an understanding of the factors that drive polarisation and violent extremism in Europe, while simultaneously understanding the factors that build more resilient communities. So Professor Paul Taylor and I represent the University of Lancaster, whose role is primarily to design a set of polarisation and resilience indicators with the input of stakeholders and consortium members. Now, these indicators were designed to ideally be applied to a range of contexts, including different forms of polarisation and resilience, and geographically speaking, indicators that can be applied to national, regional, and local levels. But we'll discuss the extent to which this has been achieved at the end of this presentation. So stakeholders and consortium members played a role in the refinement of the indicators before these were deployed as a toolkit on the project's website. And these can be used for a range of actors for self-assessment purposes and other purposes, which I'll come to later in the presentation. So in terms of our conceptual approach to polarisation and resilience, which informed the building of our indicators, we borrowed from a recent study on resilience conducted by Ellis and Abdi. Now, whilst this was developed in the United States, it is, we believe, transferable to the European context. Ellis and Abdi state that the level of resilience within a society can be assessed by the degree of state and/or community relationship building with individuals. And we compare this degree of relationship building with the EU average. For polarisation, we reverse this concept, looking instead for the degree of relationship damage, which is again compared to the EU average. Next slide, please. So to walk you briefly through our process in a little more detail, we began by deriving a theory-based long list of indicators present in the literature from a variety of fields: sociology, politics, psychology, and so on. We weren't restrictive. We then categorised these indicators according to a series of factors involved in polarisation and resilience, which were drawn from the project's concept paper. Where indicators essentially spoke to the same thing, these were then synthesised into one category. The indicators were assessed for their face validity by engaging our consortium members to see if the indicators fitted their knowledge and experiences within their respective countries. And additional literature and searches were then conducted and indicators added where relevant. We then determined a set of measures for each indicator. Some indicators just have the one measure, while others have multiple. And all are drawn from open source reports and data repositories from both the EC and other reputable independent research organisations. Our draft set of indicators and measures were presented at a face-to-face workshop and 2 online workshops with various stakeholders from different countries. And they were then further presented to the consortium again, and at each feedback stage, they underwent further refinement until a final set was reached. Next slide, please. So this is the final set. For polarisation, we have a set of 20 indicators arranged under 10 factors from the project's concept paper. So as you can see, some of the indicators apply to multiple types of polarisation, such as ethnic, racial, religious, and gendered, and so on. But even where they apply to different forms of polarisation, they can be measured in different ways. So for example, political intergroup conflict is measured by, for instance, a country's peace index score, while ethnic racial intergroup conflict is measured by experiences of violence as a result of one's ethnic or racial background. Next slide. For resilience, we have a further set of 20 indicators arranged under the resilience factors identified in the project's concept paper. Again, some indicators apply to more than one type of resilience, and some are applied to just the one. However, this is not to say that the indicator cannot be applied to other forms. It's just that we could not locate comparable measures to match, and I'll come to why that was important later. So, for example, creating something together within a community, such as a community resource that's shared by all, is seen as a means of enhancing societal bonds. This is primarily assigned to the socio-economic category. However, we know from our database work on our project, where we looked at different practices and projects involved in combating polarisation and building resilience, that co-creative projects exist to create bonds between specific segments of a community. So they are out there, it's just that we don't have comparable measures to measure them here. Okay, next slide. So the applications of the indicators are varied in nature, depending on who wishes to utilise them. So for practitioners, the indicators allow them to quantify polarisation and resilience, providing evidence for what they may observe on the ground. For policymakers, the indicators can help to inform where to best direct resources for tackling polarisation or building resilience within their own communities, as there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And finally, for researchers, the indicators allow individuals to ask questions on the basis of country comparisons. Okay, next slide. So to go through a worked example, say we have a policymaker in the Netherlands who may have been tasked with creating new policy initiatives to address ethnic and racial polarisation within their country. In order to begin developing these indicators, they may first wish to gain an understanding of the nature of ethnic and racial polarisation within the Netherlands. The BRAVE indicators will assist them in tailoring their initiatives to particular areas of need. So to begin, they'll be presented with a map, such as the one shown here, from which they can select a type of polarisation or resilience on the right-hand menu, and hover over their country to see its overall polarisation versus resilience scores across the project indicators, and that's shown in that pop-out box there that you can see. Next slide. So if they click on their country, they can then view these scores in relation to other countries featured in the BRAVE project, and we have 10 countries featured. So as we can see here, like Greece, Hungary and Italy, the Netherlands has a plus polarisation score and a minus resilience score. So while its profile is not as pronounced as other countries following a similar trend, this is still somewhat surprising. To further understand the reasons for this, the policymaker can click to view a breakdown of the Netherlands polarisation scores. Next slide. So this breakdown is presented in the form of a series of charts such as the one shown here. And looking across all such charts, the breakdown tells the policymaker that the Netherlands scores above the EU average on indicators in the following categories: online polarisation, mainstream disengagement, discrimination, and antagonistic environment. This is particularly the case for online polarisation, where its score is higher than other EU features countries, as you can see here, just illustrated on the chart for you. So therefore, the policymaker may wish to target initiatives in this particular area. However, they may also wish to understand the nuances within a particular category. And for this, they can download and view the raw data. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the mainstream disengagement category, some raw data. And I should say first that country scores are derived from Z scores, not the raw figures listed here. So as can be seen from the shading, or lack thereof, it's not so much that ethnic minorities within the Netherlands lack engagement with politics, but they do demonstrate a distrust of state-run establishments and political systems. So how might the policymaker seek to develop initiatives around enhancing trust with such communities? The answer comes in building resilience. Next slide, please. As with polarisation, the user can request a breakdown of a country's resilience scores. For the Netherlands, negative resilience scores can be observed for the categories of social inclusion, positive image online, a sense of belonging, and equal opportunities. Of these, addressing a lack of social inclusion may assist in building ethnic minority trust in political systems, in that ethnic minorities will be able to see themselves represented within these systems. Existing areas of resilience might also be utilised here. The same resilience breakdown shows us that the Netherlands scores above the EU average on positive wellbeing, community engagement, democratic reporting, community cohesion, and a supportive environment. Next slide, please. So raw data on community engagement, to give an example, shows us that in terms of proactively engaging with the needs of ethnic communities, the Netherlands has existing effective campaigns and representative bodies, the links with which could be leveraged to connect with and thus build trust with ethnic minority communities. It also shows us where gaps can be plugged, for example, by involving ethnic minorities more in critical decision making, which may also assist in developing trust between ethnic minority community members and state actors. Next slide, please. Now, as with all toolkits, and as the Greece team have also outlined in relation to their indicators, this is not a perfect instrument. We have a reduced set of indicators and measures that have been subjected to statistical validity checks, but in the interest of completeness, all indicators and measures are currently displayed in our toolkit. So this brings me to the toolkit's limitations. So primarily due to our need to find comparable data across the 10 EU countries featured in the BRAVE project, our indicators typically provide a view from a national level. However, they could be adapted for regional or local purposes where such data is available. And due to the nature of our source data, which often but not always consists of survey data, there is a heavy leaning towards perceived as opposed to actual polarisation and resilience. And what we get is a snapshot of the situation informed by the most recent data that we have available. Where measures are drawn from repeated surveys, one could conceivably look at change over time. However, generally speaking, measures are drawn from a one-off data point. Final slide, please. So finally, our toolkit can be found at the project website at the following address. And you can also look at our website for details of the consortium's database of policies, practices and research, and also our concept paper, all of which fed into the development of the indicators, and our workshops also. There's information on those on there. If you have any further questions or queries, please feel free to email either Paul Taylor, who is the Lancaster University PI on the project, or myself, and we'll be happy to provide you with further information. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And yeah, the technical bugs can always happen. Thank you very much. And let me actually, I think particularly congratulate Cheryl Prentice and Paul Taylor from Lancaster University, because unlike the GREASE indicators where Rosetta and Lily had to work with our expert assessments, the BRAVE indicators were computed by the Lancaster team themselves. And I think this is important to know, and thanks to my colleagues Richard and Tina, who shared in the chat the links to the indicators for those who want to have a look also after the seminar. And let me welcome now Moritz Conradi and Esther Caraxoni from EFUS to present their work in the BRIDGE project.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, and everyone for having us. I think, yeah, now you can see our slides. So it is our pleasure to speak a few minutes about the BRIDGE project, BRIDGE, which stands for Building Resilience to Reduce Polarization and Growing Extremism. Maybe first of all, just one or two sentences on the European Forum for Urban Security for those of you who don't know us so far. The forum is a network of European local and regional authorities, which exists for 30 plus years now, and is very much a forum where cities exchange peer-to-peer, help each other, support each other at building fairer cities and safer cities. So the link between security and questions of social justice is very present here. We have around 250 members at the moment. Yeah, and we are involved in a number of European projects, leading some of them, partnering in some of them, on different questions of urban security, many of them also addressing questions of polarization and extremism, but also other topics such as domestic violence, for example, or organized crime, or really a broad range of topics. The BRIDGE project so I think it's important to note a few differences here with the two other projects that have been presented. BRIDGE is an ISFP project, so a much smaller project if you want. It's not a research project, but very much sort of implementation, a very practically oriented project, which involves quite a large number of cities and regions, and you see the list of municipalities and regions that are partnering in this project with us. Here on this slide. And our aim is very much to support these cities in, first of all, assessing polarization, so really developing an understanding of processes of polarization that are going on in the municipalities, and then also very practically to address these issues and to mitigate polarization and to find ways of preventing sort of further escalation of polarization. We have spent quite a lot of time at the beginning of the project discussing sort of the definition of polarization, because it was a term that was not super established for everyone, or that it was not a term that figured in everyone's prevention policies. For some it did, for others it didn't. And we have an expert panel which has helped us a lot in the early phases of the project, also at developing the assessment methodology that we have developed. But there's really been a lot of discussions around, you know, what can we understand as polarization? What is the relation to extremism and extremist violence? Is polarization, is it always in itself a problematic, something that is problematic, or is it also, can it also be a driver of democratization, of democratic processes, progress? So there's been a lot of discussion around these. Here you see the definition that we have found for us, so that polarization can broadly be understood as a growing fragmentation of society into antagonistic collectives, that us and them thinking and othering are very different categories, different very important processes here, and that often it is characterized by an absence of dialogue, or as sort of the end of dialogue, if you wish. And we always see it in link with radicalization and violent extremism, in the sense that polarization sort of renders renders subjects more vulnerable to radicalization, or sort of increases the vulnerability. The link to social cohesion has also been a very important one for us. And we have sort of come to understand polarization as an opposite of social cohesion, or sort of social cohesion and polarization as two extremes on a continuum. And that has been important also for us to develop that understanding, as social cohesion is really an important category in the work that we do, being sort of a precondition for urban security, but then also the aim of urban security measures, so that they would aim to foster and increase social cohesion at the local level. Let's go. Yeah, and this is where I leave the floor to Ista, my colleague on the project.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for this introductory part about EFUS, but also about the definition of polarization and its main characteristics. Now, in the following, I would like to present to you the role of local authorities when it comes to preventing and countering polarization. We observed under the Bridge project that while drivers and root causes of polarization can be located and detected at the national or even at the international level, the concrete harmful effects of polarization play out locally and can fuel tensions, conflict, radicalization, and violence. Therefore, local authorities play a key role when it comes to reacting to such challenges. Their key role is strongly linked to the fact that they have extensive knowledge, competencies regarding the prevention of violence and the enhancement of social cohesion that Moritz just mentioned. We observe that the crime prevention networks are basically the best placed to diagnose and monitor polarization, to raise awareness regarding the issue, mitigate polarization both in the short and the long term, and empower local actors, so-called resource people, to become preventive actors and act as so-called bridge builders between the different polarized groups of the local community. We may further ask why local authorities shall be particularly engaged when it comes to such actions. The reason for this that we identified is the following. Only a municipality that is cohesive and solidary can be resilient and provide security for all its citizens. This implies that when elaborating and implementing its urban security policy, the municipality needs to rely on civic participation and multi-stakeholder cooperation with the aim to include all the different groups of the community to co-produce policies and solutions. Or, by its nature, polarization leads to the rupture of social bonds, halts dialogue and productive forms of inter-community exchange and conflict resolution actions, which threatens social cohesion and community resilience. So to prevent such threats, as mentioned above, local actors are best placed to react. How shall they react? First of all, they can diagnose and monitor polarization. They can raise awareness on the topic in question within their respective local communities. They can prevent and mitigate polarization while empowering citizens and encouraging their participation in the co-production of policies and solutions. And as part of this mitigation process, local authorities can also use restorative measures to build connections or to rebuild connections between the different groups, re-engage them in dialogue, and thus decrease the level of polarization. After this short, rather theoretical part of our presentation, with my colleague Moritz, we would like to present some concrete examples to you, like some highly relevant indicators that we identified when it comes to the diagnosis and monitoring phase. Hence, in the following slide, you will see those relevant indicators that we have collected under a form of a so-called bridge toolkit. So here you see the key points, the key elements of such a toolkit. The toolkit seeks to help local authorities overcoming problems when it comes to polarization in their respective local context. However, it is key to highlight before we enter more into details when it comes to these indicators that with a few exceptions, cities do not systematically audit or monitor polarization, as the concept itself is still quite new to them and may be seen as a little bit difficult to operationalize. So that's why we try to provide them with this toolkit to help them and facilitate their work when it comes to countering polarization and preventing it. So first of all, one of the key indicators is data on demographics, socioeconomic and socio-structural inequalities, civic and political participations of the citizens. Secondly, information about so-called protective factors that reinforce community resilience and social cohesion, but also about risk factors that decrease community resilience and social cohesion, and related to which we can point out the presence of so-called polarizing agents and actors in the community. Then we have surveys on the presence of, for example, zero-sum mindset thinking. In a few words to explain what this thinking is the belief and thinking based on the idea that a person can only win if another person loses. So a group or a community can only win if the other one loses. And surveys on us and them thinking, which is highly connected to the zero-sum mindset thinking. And finally, the key assessment of existing networks within the society is crucial. It can help counter polarization, and it also counts as a main indicator under the Bridge project. Furthermore, to complement these indicators, Bridge, with the help of respective experts, also elaborated ethical guidelines that are to be followed when carrying out a polarization audit. Now we would like to present some concrete key tools for you, elaborated and or implemented by local actors that seek to support and facilitate the monitoring process. Now I would like to give the floor back to Moritz to present one key example, which is the quick scan from Rotterdam. So Moritz, the floor is yours.
Yes, so now to a few sort of practical examples on how we've operationalized things or sort of methods of actually measuring locally. And one tool that has come to us in the framework of the Bridge project that has actually really been developed by the municipality of Rotterdam and has been used there quite a lot. And I'm sure some of you have heard of it before, that they call it the quick scan. And this is really a methodology to do sort of a quick measurement of the temperature, as they say, in the municipality. And they have a network of local actors in the field, so stakeholders from different associations, from different local communities that they are in close contact with and that they can reach out to. They call them key figures, and they would sort of run a short questionnaire with them on a particular topic, which is conceived as potentially raising polarization or tensions, sort of asking questions about the causes, about the sources, about which forms of polarization or of tension they sense at the local level. And then this is compiled into a report, which is then discussed with the mayor, who is then of course deciding on ways to react. So this is a very concrete tool that one of our partners had already put in place and had already some experiences in the project, which could then be shared, of course, with the other municipalities.
Yes, so another concrete example and concrete tool is based on the above mentioned zero-sum mindset measurements or zero-sum mindset surveys. It can help to empirically measure the presence of polarization and community resilience within a respective local community via the tool of a concrete questionnaire. To point out one key questionnaire and one key example, for example, it can be always based on questions related to one's own community and one's views about another community present in the respective local context. It can also be based on values and beliefs in democratic institutions, but it can also raise from questions related to other minorities present in the respective local context. So of course, these questionnaires always need to be adapted to the local context in question, but the key set is always based on this zero-sum thinking, let's say, scale that are to be implemented. When implementing such questionnaire, the expert support is necessary, so the data collected and analyzed can be considered as valid and representative.
Yes, we have found out in the course of the project that sort of safety and victimization surveys have been very relevant to sort of generating data also on polarization, and these are surveys that many cities, rather larger cities that have the means, are running in cooperations with local universities usually, and that sort of try to collect data on sort of feelings of insecurity, of fears in the population. And we have at many points discussed sort of the links or how polarization indicators could sort of further be integrated into these surveys that are being conducted, that have been conducted before. So that is one of the vectors that some cities are working on now to see which indicators regarding polarization can be integrated into such larger criminological surveys. Another very small concrete tool is a letter of participation that one of our experts has proposed, which is a very simple sort of self-assessment tool for municipalities where they can see how open their processes are to participation from inhabitants, and it really has a scale with 10 different steps, from I have no say at all in something to I am being consulted but don't know really whether my opinion is being taken into account for a decision or not, to really having a lot of impact on the decision. So that is some very concrete practical tool that has been used. Citizens Agora is another methodology which is sort of a broader, and it has been used by some of the cities, but in pre-COVID times, to really organize workshops, very inclusive formats of roundtables, etc., which bring together different groups in the municipality. Yeah.
Yes, and well, after this, these concrete examples, which is only a few, when it comes to those measures that are being implemented by our partners at the local level based on the indicators that we just presented and that are present in the Bridge Toolkit, we would like to conclude with some thoughts and questions, open-ended questions to you. Hence, we would like to ask if, for example, among the presented indicators, you already knew of one, or if in the respective local context, maybe you already implemented one and tried out some, and if you have any feedback on that. Also, we would like to ask if maybe you have some other indicators that could be pertinent to this aspect when it comes to assessing and monitoring polarization. And of course, we would like to ask if you have faced some specific difficulties when aiming to use such indicators. What is left for us to do with my colleague Moritz is to thank you for your attention. We invite you for further discussion, and please do not hesitate to contact us, come back to us whenever you have some questions related to the presentation itself or the Bridge project per se as a whole. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Morris and Esther. I think your presentation actually rounds up very nicely the other presentations in that you gave us some very concrete examples of how, for instance, local authorities can develop and use indicators, and I see some relevant questions in the chat. Let me give us all a 3-minute, not 5-minute break. So 3-minute break. It's 6 past the hour on my watch, so let's say maximum 10 past. We're back. As I said, this is the opportunity to stretch your legs or think about questions you want to ask our presenters. Thank you very much. As I said earlier, let me welcome Rick Coulside, Mathieu Orsi, and Martin van den Donk as our discussants. Without further ado, Rick Coulside, the floor is yours for your questions and comments to the presentations. And let me remind all that you received through my colleague Valentina Bettin a chapter of Rick Coulside that is forthcoming in an Oxford handbook, and that elaborates more on what he will try to summarize in 5 minutes.
Okay, Anna, impossible to summarize in 5 minutes, of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the 3 presentations. To make sure, these are very ambitious undertakings. I mean, it is not easy to put so complex societal issues into indicators, into simple programs, as simple as some of the political parties would present the issue. So good luck to the presentations, to the project, and I think that everybody is looking forward to the results, including the practical results that we can use on the spot. So I will give a couple of quick takeaways. I'm not going into the details of the presentations. A couple of quick takeaways, which, in one sense or another, apply to all 3 presentations. The first one being, all of the presentations try to identify a link between an environment and an outcome. Environment being a polarized society, or the state of the state religious minorities relationship on the one hand, and violent extremism. We have to be very careful in establishing this link, because as the old tradition in terrorism studies already made clear, violent extremism or violence or terrorism is not an automatic outcome of a given situation. I mean, it is not because you have a polarized society that the outcome is automatically violence or violent extremism, as it's now called, or terrorism. It raises the question of agency. In order to explain why there is violent extremism beyond the environment, you do need to take into account elements which are very hard to quantify, such as mobilization hubs, the presence of a discourse, the presence of a cause that attracts people, that mobilizes people. So it is not because we have a list of indicators that we can predict the outcome being violence. That's one point. So there's no automatic link between the 2. Second point, and I think in the chat some made already the link, be it Horizon 2020 or ISF, is, as we all are, heavily influenced by what happened the last couple of years. I mean, the series of attacks, the foreign fighters issues, kids leaving for Syria and Iraq, which is normal. But this also translates into the focus of the projects. I was struck by the definition of polarization that Moritz of EFUS gave. This polarization definition also applies to, for instance, the United States today. I mean, the United States, when we speak about polarization, we nowadays think less, as we did a couple of years ago, about the jihadi mobilization, the young Muslims, etc., etc. We think about the United States. And in the United States, what you see is that local authorities, unfortunately, are part of the polarization mechanism. So what do you do with the instruments that you come up if your local authority is part of the problem? Somebody in the chat mentioned right-wing extremism in Europe or in the West in general. It is indeed true that right-wing extremism nowadays are much more of a concern to security services than jihadi terrorism. And the question is, when you come up with indicators and with instruments, are they applicable to all contexts? Are they applicable also to the contemporary issues in the United States or right-wing extremism? This would be the ultimate litmus test for the suggestions, for the results of the projects. Point 3. When looking through the 3 presentations, you come up with a long list of indicators. I'm afraid, in a certain sense, that this identification of indicators, that you will face the same difficulty of the old discussion on root causes of terrorism as it started to be discussed in the 60s and the 70s. There are so many indicators. As there are so many root causes, that it is impossible to obtain a consensus, a political and academic consensus on the indicators, which happened. Well, I'm not going into the detail. And are they really as quantifiable as we might wish they are, when you are confronted with the ambiguity of the notions that we are using? Moritz here used a description or definition of polarization, but when we come to radicalization, it's much less clear. I'm not sure that the standard or the standard definition of radicalization, you gain radical ideas and you go into action. I'm not quite sure, honestly, that this is really what is going on and what is the most important. Look, in all of the European countries, or well, more broadly, all the countries, all the kids who went to Syria and Iraq, when they're over there because of their radical ideas, or because simply of peer pressure, thrill-seeking, personal difficulties. So then how do you qualify and quantify the radicalization, especially if you want to draw up indicators of violent radicalization? I have still 27 points to develop, which I won't do. It's only a last one, which is, it has been stressed in some of the presentations, we have many data on the national level, but most of the mobilization, and I prefer mobilization to the word radicalization, much of the mobilization happens at the local level. And so it is difficult, again, to gauge the radicalization, violent extremism at the local level using national data. And to give you one example from my own country, Belgium, we have 2 important hubs where kids left for Syria. You have Antwerp in the north, Brussels in the south. In the middle of the 2, you have a city which is called Mechelen, which has the same demographics as Antwerp and Brussels, but no one left to Syria and Iraq. So this means that using the same national indicators, you would be unable to explain the local dynamic in this particular city of Mechelen. And for the rest of the 27 remarks, I will put them on paper.
Thank you very much, Rick. Yeah, I think this is the litmus test for all indicators. But I mean, we can discuss about it immediately after the other two discussants. Mathieu or C, the floor is yours for your short comment.
Thanks a lot. Do you hear me? Yeah, right. I am Mathieu Orsi and I work in DG Home, the European Commission, in the unit dealing with prevention of radicalization. I think the presentations we heard today were really important, decisive, I would say, because as policymakers, we need solid and really reliable data. We need also to go beyond evidence. And I think that's the added value of such indicators that you presented, is that they go precisely beyond what could be seen as obvious. I think also that an added value of these indicators that they are not just based on perceived situations or feelings, but that they rely also on solid on solid data, and policymakers definitely need evidence-based info, data, and that the role and the value, I think, of your work. Most of the time, policymakers are confronted to a bit of a difficulty to distinguish between reliable data, precisely, and ideological position. And I think that the work you've presented today, funded by us, so I'm also glad and proud that the European Commission has been capable of finding such amazing teams. So I think the projects you presented today are of great help for policymakers to then implement valid responses to the problems you've explained. I won't say many things about the RAN, the Radicalization Awareness Network, which is one of the EU answer to the challenges we are facing. But Martin van den Donk, who is the next speaker, will probably say a word on that. Just to ask you a question. What would you like policymakers concretely do with your indicators? Because we are a union of 27 member states, so we need a consensus. Sometimes in the indicators, I see that there are quite a lot of differences between member states. Your studies are not based on the 27 samples of member states, but when you emphasize the differences between them. So since we have to implement one policy from the European Union, which is a consensus one, what would you like concretely us to do with your indicators? That would be my question. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. Yeah, this is $1 million question that I'm glad you're returning to us, because usually it's the researchers who say, oh, here's our findings, do something.
Yes, but it's too simple. So that's why I want to put not the blame, but the burden on you.
Yeah, thank you. Challenge accepted. Martin van den Donk.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, I also would like to express my gratitude for the 3 presentations you gave, and also the pile of information and food for thought you provided to us. Actually, as Mathieu already said, I'm working for the Radicalisation Awareness Network. We are a network of practitioners. And I looked at your presentations with that point of view. And I think then one of the most important points to make all has to do with time. If I saw the outcomes of the Greece project, for example, I saw that you had a lot of data of 2015 and 16. And if we look back at that era, we see that this was still the time that people left for Syria. And if you would look now, when we look at societal tensions, we see Black Lives Matters, we see Yellow Jackets, we see a lot of new things coming up. And I think it's good to be aware of this. I'm also aware of the fact that you as researcher only can retrieve data of things that already happened. So in this sense, this is no form of critique, but we have to be aware of this. And actually this brings me to the following point. I think we have to distinguish when we talk about evaluation and when we talk about indicators and what are the long-term evaluations of a phenomenon and what is happening on the streets right now. And then the $1 million question there is, how are they related to each other? Because, for example, we see now in a lot of the COVID riots that also a lot of these old groups are coming back again, or we see again the same old mechanisms. So in this sense, it's not problematic that we retrieve data from years from the past, but it would be good to have this development also to see what can we learn for now. Another thing, and then and that's perhaps contradictory to it, but what I heard from Moritz during the Bridge project. For example, if you see, yes, also quick scan teams are possible, and I know, and indeed also of these projects of key figures. However, what we now also saw with the COVID-19, and especially in Rotterdam, I happen to live there, so I know a bit more of that. You see that riots concerning or uprisings concerning COVID-19 were not seen among the key figures that were gathered by the city. And this simply has to do with the fact that when you're having a quick scan team and you're working with key figures, it's giving you information on the potential threats we already know, because that's how you're looking for your key figures. I think actually mentioning these points may sound very, very pessimistic, but I'm still very positive about this because, and now I come to my final point, what I think is that your work has brought up is again, making us reflect about these indicators. And it would be good, I think, for practitioners perhaps not to have the whole data set or how to do this, because, for example, a youth worker will never be able to perform research like you have done, or perhaps to read it because he doesn't have the time. But if I saw, for example, during the presentation of Brave that you had these indicators for resilience, it is good for a practitioner to have this kind of short checklist. If they're making a new program, did we at least think about this? Because that's at the end of the day what practitioners are doing, especially to the new threats, not to the old ones, is to find solutions for current threats with the experience of yesterday. And I think you contributed to that in your 3 projects, and thanks again for that.
Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah, some very good points. Actually, in the interest of time, because we're almost at 1:30, may I ask the presenters to keep in mind which points of the discussions they want to address, but also let me just ask some questions that have already been shared in the chat. I think there is one question that has come a couple of times in the chat, which is the relationship between radicalization and terrorism, and in assessing factors of terrorism versus factors of violent radicalization. A very interesting, most recent question was about the individual versus the collective level of extremism and polarization, taking the example of Catalonia, where people may fight in politics, but individually, at the individual or kind of personal family level, have no problem in discussing with one another. Another question was the extent to which we can use the same indicators to assess violent radicalization that is religiously inspired or religiously attributed versus violent radicalization or polarization that relates to the far right or white supremacy and similar. And a methodological question, I'm just picking up some, so as to, and we can come back to some of the others, is how does each project, in the case of the bridge projects, define the relative terms like polarization, extremism, resilience, etc. So maybe I'll start with Lily and Rositza, so we go in the same order, so you have also the others have some time to think. And Lily and Rositza, please give us a brief response or contribution.
Okay, I will start. Thank you so much to the commentators and also to the very active audience. It's always good when we have a lot of questions and provoke discussion. So just picking up on a few of these points from the commentators and also from the questions in the chat. So I very much agree with Rick and his comments, and I mentioned this in my presentation as well, that it's very hard to quantify some of the very, very crucial aspects related to violent radicalization, such as the mobilization networks, ideas, discourses, ideology. We haven't attempted to do that. I think it's too ambitious. It's just to kind of clear that out of the way, this misconception that these indicators measure actually radicalization and levels of it. It's not what they are. I don't think anybody has done that successfully in the past. So we are, of course, have no kind of pretension at all to do that. I think it's what we try to do, and this ties to the time question of Martin as well, is just to see trends on different aspects, on different factors, on different kind of societal, let's say, relationships. And see how they have changed throughout the years. The ambition of the GREASE project initially was indeed to make such an analysis from 2000 to 2020 in 5 years intervals, which we didn't do because it wasn't possible due to the data. But in terms of the data that we analyze, it's not forward-looking at all. It's just reflecting on what has been, and it's always discussed. You can look up the country assessments on the website of the GREASE project. It's always discussed in the context of what's been going on. Like, for instance, the economic crisis had still some impact on on some attitudes. The ISIS crisis, of course, and what happened 2015 and afterwards, the terrorist attacks, the foreign fighters issue, it does have a huge impact. So it's always contextualized in that way. I think in touching upon some of the more conceptual questions that came up in the chat as well, I would very much recommend, because we don't have much time, for you to look up on the GREASE website. We have an excellent conceptual paper written by Hisham Helier from RUSI and Michelle Grossman, I think they're among us today, which deals exactly with this question, the relationship between religion, ideology, radicalization, extremism, and violence. Because, of course, not all extremism is violent, and not all violence is ideological. And of course, this is not what we argue in these indicators. A relationship between radicalization and terrorism, yeah, very relevant. We by no means try to equate that. We are basically trying to capture different factors that may or may not contribute to the rise of radicalization, and then certain incidents that are related to religiously inspired violent extremism. But as mentioned, a lot of aspects are missing, and also we are by no way attempting to kind of do correlations and causation, to kind of have conclusions on causation and say, okay, when polarization on this indicator rises, oh, then you have a higher incidence of violent extremist acts. That's not the case. It's much more complicated than that. And maybe final point. Yeah, again, these are not explanatory factors of radicalization per se. On the question, what should policymakers do? I have a very particular kind of view on this because I come from Eastern Europe. But okay, there are more important questions maybe to discuss, because I do think that in Eastern Europe, a lot of issues related to far-right extremism, polarization remain hugely underestimated. But I'll finish here. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I think that was an indirect answer. Yes, let me give the floor to Sharon.
I think do you want me to do it, Cheryl, or? Yeah, okay, thanks. I think the questions you asked, Anna, very much relate to Rick's first point about environmental causes to outcome. I think from the BRAVE perspective, we've never really been trying to predict outcome. We've been really looking at the backcloth of opportunity, both for polarization and opportunity for resilience within communities, and trying to measure those two opportunities. So another way of saying that is we are not at any point, our indicators are not measures of radicalization, they are measures of the potential environment, using Rick's word, that may make people more vulnerable to that. So something like family dynamics, that was one of the things you mentioned, can be a resilience indicator, in the sense that good family dynamics are known to reduce the backcloth of opportunity towards becoming more polarized and resilient, and towards radicalization. So some of those are more difficult to measure than others, and as Martin's pointed out, data is at the heart of this, the quality of the data is at the heart of it, the timeliness of the data is at the heart of this. And actually, I think that from our experience on BRAVE, there's a fundamental question here as to whether data is ever going to be able to deliver you a rich enough picture to make any judgments other than what the data shows. And I suspect you'll come on to that, Anna, with other questions later on. One of the other questions that was just brought up by you was whether or not the indicators can be applied to other areas. And this was a really interesting point for the BRAVE project, because originally when we structured our indicators, it was around a very different structure. It was around a conceptual structure, picking up things like ideology, access to materials, and that sort of thing. And in one of our lovely meetings in Florence, we were pulled apart on that, and it was made very clear to us that actually the structure of the indicators should go along different forms of polarization and resilience. And hence you'll have seen Cheryl present on things like gendered polarization versus religious polarization. And that has a deliberate flexibility there, that it allows you to encompass other forms of activism coming on. So in England at the moment, there's more increasing concern around environmental polarization and potential extremism. And some of those dimensions that are now in the BRAVE toolkit speak to that. They speak to it in very different ways than they speak to far-right extremism or Islamic extremism, but they do speak to it. They have that greater flexibility. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul. Cheryl, do you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, well, just to reiterate what Paul was saying, we're more looking at the environment rather than saying that this specifically measures, say, radicalization. It's more kind of looking at the wider context. Also, it's important to point out that we're very much pro this kind of working alongside expert judgment. So it's not to say, here's the answer. It's more to say, you know, to act as a guide, really, alongside expert judgments.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Esther and Moritz?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for all these questions that made us reflect a lot by hearing them. So maybe I will start with one concrete question from Mathieu Orshi from DG Home. You know, what can the EU level do with such indicators with regards to local authorities? So one idea that came up when we discussed this question with Moritz is that potentially we can create kind of like an EU level toolkit addressed to local authorities, available to local authorities, and readaptable by local authorities to their needs, which can somewhat answer the question, you know, the difference between the 27 member states, how they can react, how the local authorities within them can react. The key is always to tailor these indicators to their local needs, but to provide them with a set of tools from which they can pick and choose and tailor it to their needs. Also, what is key is dialogue between EU institutions, the relevant DGs of the European Commission and local authorities. So, for example, to readapt such toolbox and such EU level indicators when needed, So that's also something that is to be crucial and to be made as regular between the actors, and also potentially to provide local authorities with trainings when it comes to teaching them how to use these indicators, because of course now in the BREACH project we had a few local partners, but far from what could be helpful and useful at the EU level. So basically to allow them to participate in such trainings and to give them the possibility to learn to use these indicators. When it comes to Rick's question, that's quite tricky. What do we do when the local authority is part of the problem? That's a hard question. One thing that we observed is that for us, the work under the BREACH project can only be possible because local authorities are voluntary. They want to participate, they want to engage. When it's not the case, then the role of NGOs, civil society platforms become crucial. Also the role of so-called resource people who are willing to act, be not only reactive but proactive, and potentially push for a change at the local level. So either to encourage local authorities to change their position, or even to push for a political change when it comes to the political leadership at the local level. But also Moritz can further complement these answers. Thank you.
Yes, I've also been trying to keep to take a few notes and to respond to some of the comments from Rick and from Martin. I think in a certain way, for us, for the BRIDGE project, the starting point of that was that the municipalities that are participating are aware that they are part of the problem, and that we all are part of the problem, and that we all get caught up in such dynamics, and that we need to work on our awareness on how these work and how we get entangled in them and what we can do to prevent the further escalation. And that is a common understanding of the actors involved, to work on that with the different civil society actors in the municipalities, to work on ways to find ways out of spirals, if you want to call it that. And for many of them, the questions you raised regarding the concept of radicalization, I share much of that. And in the BRIDGE project, many of the concrete phenomena that we have been looking at and working on have not really concerned Islamist extremism or radicalization or people leaving to Syria or Iraq. That was far from being the key topic. There were sometimes really very local dynamics around very different questions. And of course, as part of this was already also then during the COVID pandemic, then really lots of different questions came up, questions of age groups and how forms of polarization, for example, were forming in that context. So really a very large set of questions. Martin, your comment to the key figures and also the context of COVID, I think it's very, very pertinent, obviously, and it shows the need to constantly rethink and to readapt also our networks or the people that we speak to, or the data that we have, and to really adapt them to new challenges. And I think that is very much a constant process. Then there was a question in the chat regarding the particular resilience scores that we've used, and I want to just refer you to the working paper, and I've shared the link where you will see that we have looked at different scores there and shared them with the cities, and then used them as examples and sources to inspire us. But we're not saying this one is better than the other. It's always really a question of looking at what you want to see at the local level.
Thank you very much. I think I have a couple of more questions that I want to take from those from the chat room. So I think actually Michelle Grossman, who is both a partner at Greece and involved in the advisory board of RAID, was asking, among other things, about do we understand polarization as between a state and its citizens, or between citizen groups? And I was wondering whether this also relates to what Beatriz Barreiro was asking about the individual and the collective level of polarization. Another question or comment that has been in the chat room is, I think, pertains to one particular indicator in the Greece project, which is the autonomy of religious institutions. Is this, what does this indicate in terms of the governance of religious diversity? And maybe, no, sorry, one more question from the chat room, most recent one: how can indicators say something or incorporate the experience of frontline workers in the field of prevention? And I don't know, maybe this is a question also for Martin van der Donk, if he has any insights. And maybe I can ask one reflection and one question on my part, which is addressed both to all of us, but also maybe to our funders. So one question is the sustainability of indicators created by projects. So our idea of creating the indicators is trying to simplify knowledge and communicate it more easily. But then the question is, can there be sustainability? And in that respect, I think, yeah, we need perhaps to do more, and any questions or comments on this are most welcome, at least on my part. And then, of course, the use. How do we, so this is a question for both our speakers and our discussants. How do we see the use? I think the Bridge project partly responds to this in terms of it's more a self-monitoring, self-assessment and raising awareness. But we know that by the media, indicators of different kinds are used to name and shame, or to name and praise, or to say this is going better, or it is going for the worse in some country or in some region. And I think we need to be very aware of that, because were it for us researchers, we could perfectly do with our more contextual and rich explanations. But then the question is how these are used by the media, and also how can this simplified knowledge be useful for the policymakers? And I think my answer to your question, Mathieu, is that what we're asking for is perhaps for more synergies between research and policy making. And the indicators are a tool in this dialogue. And last, of course, there is the question that I think has been also hovering a bit in the chat room about how can you apply, not just between the local and the national within a specific European country, for instance, but how can we apply, this was particularly a challenge for the Greece project, how can an indicator that is valid for Italy be valid for Egypt and Indonesia? And that we make sure, and I know Rosica, Lily, and also Tommaso, who is the third member of the team, Tommaso Comunale, have been banging their heads on the wall like sometimes during this last year. And we've had very important, I think, conversations, even the very meaning of what is religiously inspired violent radicalization. So this is my contribution, and maybe we can take some more commentary. I don't know, Lily or Rosica, if you want to go first.
I'll just let Lily address the question on the autonomy issue. Just wanted to add, because it's also important to look at the context from which these indicators arise. And I think in particular, in the case of Greece, we do have very specific research questions that we need to answer. And these indicators were developed because we wanted to look from the perspective of, so what can we learn from different models of governing religious diversity, of secularism and so on, and how does it relate to radicalization? So these are very specific research questions. It's not a matter of producing indicators that can be like a standalone exercise. I mean, if that's the case at some point in the future, the better, but just the context is also important in terms of what we want to achieve in what particular context these indicators arise.
Yeah, and I also want to add on this, when we were creating the indicators, not just the ones on religion and state, but also the radicalization ones, we were constantly wondering about context, because we want to apply these indicators not just to 23 countries on the Greece project, but to all countries. And it was really, really a challenge to do that. And for example, we would be changing the measurements of the scales for for the different sub-indicators multiple times, because there would be feedback from one partner or another partner. Okay, this doesn't work for my country, or this doesn't work for my country. And we were just scratching our heads what to do. And actually, eventually what we came up with was to really, when we apply the indicators, to give every expert the opportunity to comment on sub-indicators or on what the trends are for composite indicators for their country. Because it's just impossible with any kind of indicators. It's impossible to put a straitjacket on all countries. There is always context which needs to be taken into consideration. So we are quite aware of this. And now I just want to address the question about the autonomy of religious institutions, and it's a very, very valid point. So thank you for the question. We are not measuring with this sub-indicator, we are not measuring whether independence of religious institutions is good or bad. So that's not the point of the indicators. We just want to measure trends. What is the level of autonomy? And we don't want to make judgments on whether it's a good or bad thing. And the scales, the measurements, they don't do this. They just measure level of independence. So eventually it's up to the expert who is doing the evaluation whether they would think it's a good or bad thing. But the actual sub-indicators, they don't have as a purpose to measure good or bad. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, Paul and Cheryl.
So I think there's 6 questions that were raised by you, Anna, so I'll go through them briefly. The first one was, are we measuring state-to-person or person-to-person polarization? And that's precisely why we changed the structure of ours to these different thematic categories. So one of ours is political polarization and resilience. And that is very much speaking to national to local. Another is social polarization and resilience, and that's very much speaking to community level dynamics. And one would expect to see different scores on those depending on what was going on within the country, and then that would hopefully help policymakers address different types of polarization or resilience concerns within their countries. The comment on religious freedom is really interesting for us, because one thing that we do, because indicators speak to multiple dimensions, is try to capture some of the interrelationships between those different factors. So, for example, going to that specific question, how religious and political dynamics might be playing out. But I don't think we captured that fully or most effectively. And that's something that maybe is worth exploring in the future. Third question was about how this helps frontline workers. Well, this allows us to really show off, I think, one of the other excellent products of Brave, which isn't on show today, which is the catalogue of practices that are out there, good practices in countries across Europe. And so our thinking around this was that the indicators would give you a sense of which type of dynamics are most important for your community. You can then go to the catalogue and look at what other people with similar profiles have found as being successful as a frontline worker. Now, you might look at those and say, actually, that's not going to work for me, and that's fine, because only you would have the best knowledge of what to do with your local community. But the hope is that those other examples would be inspiring to you and give you food for thought as ways to move forward. So in a sense, what we've done is try and give you a structured way of accessing what other frontline workers have done in your scenario, or certainly a perceived similar scenario. Question 4 is about sustainability, and that really talks to the question that Matthew raised. It's a really difficult question to answer. It goes back to the data one. In a sense, having subjective judgments done every 3 months is just going to be too expensive. The human power there would be colossal. And then the formal, in a sense, I worry might be too hard. So it's very difficult to get at community level dynamics in a way that can feed up with more formal data that Cheryl and I explored. And in fact, that was one of the purposes of our project, I think, to see how far you could push formal data in terms of giving you insights. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that sustainability question. but I think my answer would be that it has to be driven locally. I appreciate there must be a 27-country EU-wide policy, but I very much agree with Lily that what you're giving really is a policy of toolboxes, and people should select from them to fit their own circumstance. There was a question about simplified knowledge. I can't remember what that was, so I'm going to skip it. And then finally, there's one about the validity of indicators. Again, that's a question I think for researchers to really pull apart relative to their local context, and that's a qualitative and quantitative question. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Paul. Cheryl, do you have anything?
I was just going to jump in on a point that Michelle raised about potential predictive value of indicators, because I know, Paul, that was something that we were quite interested in exploring in future work on this project, was using the existing data and looking at how that may assist us in prediction, because ultimately that's where you'd like to go with this. So that's an ongoing piece of work, but it is something we're aware of and that we would like to explore.
Thank you very much. Esther and Moritz?
Yes, maybe one remark about the sustainability component. So one part of the Bridge project that we could not present to you today is actually the fact that based on the audit carried out on the indicators presented, local actors also elaborate and implement pilot projects. And this is really where the sustainability aspect also gets a special emphasis, because these pilot projects seeks to tackle the problem or prevent the problem for the long term. So whenever we elaborate jointly with the local partners and with the help of experts, the pilot project, this is a key aspect. So to this regard, actually not only the indicators and what we discovered with them seeks to be something sustainable, so to create a sustainable tool, but also to create concrete sustainable actions to prevent polarization and tackle it on the long term. And this is something that you said, Anna, also is key, which is the links between good practices, pilot projects, research, and policymaking. So sustainability is highly linked to the fact that policymaking needs to reflect what was detected, carried out, and implemented at the local, national, and also international level. So that would be this remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Moritz?
Yeah, not much to add actually from my side. Maybe just to explain a little further that from our perspective, the question of sort of how is our frontline workers implicated in this question of sustainability is really that for us the perspective is to look at how the question of polarization can be sort of included in a broader urban security strategy, and that would mean in terms of an assessment, but also in terms of responses, to really integrate these into the existing local networks around questions of crime prevention more broadly. So really municipalities have a lot of resources, a lot of partnerships locally that are already doing a lot, and that sort of are a great potential and a great resource when it comes to also addressing well, the question of polarization, which has really gained a lot in importance and in presence, let's say.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we come to a conclusion that the world is complex and imperfect, and we do what we can. I think well, there's so many more issues to discuss. I think this is a good time to close this workshop, because I think we've got some answers, because we've got more questions, and that's probably a more creative or productive way of concluding. You can see that in the chat there have been several resources shared, not just by the 3 projects that have been presented today, but also by other projects, and thank you to the participants who shared these resources. And I understand we have a pretty much international audience, both from within, but also from outside Europe. So I think that is very useful, that we need more work in this field. And of course, I think we all acknowledge the limitations of indicators, but also the power they have in exactly identifying trends, also comparing between countries. And even, I think, as Paul said, let us move between the conceptual and the more practical. So yeah, I very much remember our discussions, was it, I think, July 2019, about how we can go about creating these indicators. Also some very lively discussions within the Greece project on what means what in what context, and how we can operationalize this. And on this, I would like to thank you all and to invite you to stay connected, both with us at the EUI and the Global Governance Program, but also the specific projects, the 3 presented here, but also the other projects that are in the chat. And of course, please do not hesitate to reach out to each one of us by email. You've seen the emails in the PowerPoints for whatever question or additional comment or initiative. Thank you all and have a nice afternoon.